welcome to the MassFactor. You know, everybody's been hearing for, I don't know, decades now about the changes in manufacturing in this country and how jobs are going overseas. So we're going to learn a little about it with a guy who hopefully knows about it. His name is Ted Bauer. He's with an organization called Mass. Do you say Massmep or MEP or?
Massmep is
it's such a boring name.
way.
You guys need a sexier name. Thank you for being here today.
I appreciate you having me. Thank
Good
you,
to have
Todd.
you. So this is part of a national organization. Each state has its own edition, right?
That's correct. There are MEP centers, manufacturing extension partnerships in all 50 states, including the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. And
see, I was hoping you wouldn't say those words because it's just so dry. It sounds like so pseudo-governmental, but you guys are doing something that's exciting. So I'd rather focus on that. You're trying to help manufacturers be competitive here in Massachusetts. Is that what the task is?
That's correct. In a nutshell, our primary role is to help manufacturers be globally competitive and grow. We carry out a lot of different project work and have a number of focuses to allow them to do that. I head up the workforce development component of the Massmep, and that's a critical part. You cannot grow an organization without the workforce and an appropriately skilled workforce.
So let's back up and talk a little bit about what happened, because you've spent your life in manufacturing, right?
Mm-hmm. I have, yes.
I have a personal memory and experience. I grew up with a family friend that owned FootJoy shoes down in Brockton. And I heard through the years about the changes going on there. Having to ship jobs overseas a little at a time, how they didn't want to do it, but they had to do it to stay competitive. And now we're in a situation where people perceive that somehow all the manufacturing jobs have left the United States, but that's not the case at all, right?
It is not, and that's an unfortunate misconception.
I mean, we're still, I think, the #2 manufacturer in the world.
We certainly are in that range, and manufacturing is still alive and well in the United States. Its complexion rather, has changed somewhat. We are not really strong in a lot of the commodity manufacturing, textiles and shoes.
There used to be a place called Mighty Mac up on the North Shore here that made great jackets, and I remember those owners fighting to keep the jobs here, and they really destroyed the company by fighting to keep the jobs here, which was an unfortunate situation to be in. But you're saying a structural change took place where those types of jobs moved overseas. So what do we manufacture in Massachusetts? What are we good at?
Well, commonly we refer to our current manufacturing base as advanced manufacturing. High technology has taken place of the routine, the routine manual type operations that were really part of the landscape back 20, 30 years ago. And we're into employing technology to produce products that are not easy to do in countries that do not have the infrastructure from the education, the skilled workforce.
Can you give us a sample of what would that be? How is it? Are we talking about things? I know a guy who has a manufacturing company, and he makes single serve, unique machinery to do specialty manufacturing. So he's basically creating one thing for one customer. That type of manufacturing. Is that what you're talking about, or is it not mass production anymore?
Well, we refer to it often as low volume, high mix, high tolerance.
That's what we do in Massachusetts.
That's what we do in Massachusetts primarily.
So along the lines of my friend, what his company does, where it's single serve.
That's correct, and that is a large part of what we do. But you asked for an example of the type of products. Medical devices, for instance, are a very large component of the manufacturing infrastructure here in Massachusetts. Instrumentation of all types is another large component of manufacturing.
And that's our end of the business because we have the schools here to educate the workforce?
That is part of that. That is part of the reason that we do have the educational system to support that. But when the evolution of the transition was happening from the low-tech to the high-tech, we did have a better infrastructure than in emerging China, for instance. So we were always able to step up a little bit to keep our competitive edge, as opposed to trying to follow the lowest cost route.
And is that position in the marketplace, does that put us in a permanent shrinkage mode, where we're always going to be chasing up higher, which, you know, we're assuming it's pyramid shaped here, that there are fewer jobs all the time as you get more specialized.
Well, it's an interesting question from the standpoint that, yes, most success of industries is often measured by the headcount, if you will, how many people are employed. But the necessity of today's environment is that we have to be competitive, we have to have productivity on our side. And so by necessity, yes, there's more automation happening, and there are fewer people employed today in manufacturing than there were perhaps 20 or 30 years ago, than there were in fact 20 or 30 years ago. However, that's not necessarily a bad thing because our manufacturing output has actually risen.
Output measured by dollars?
Output measured by dollars, by gross state product produced here, and by exports. Massachusetts is a high export industry in the manufacturing
But is that
space.
trend where we're going? Is it going to keep becoming less jobs all the time, or will that trend turn at some point? What's the expectation?
Well, I wish I had really the ability to look that far into the future, but I think our shrinkage in jobs I think has stabilized quite a bit because we are growing the industry today, and there is a thing called reshoring. There is actual work coming back to the United States.
You mean jobs that have moved overseas?
Yes.
And they're coming back here because?
They're coming back here because the costs are rising overseas. And the most important part of that is the supply chain implications. When you ship things thousands and thousands of miles over oceans and what have you, that whole supply chain infrastructure becomes very stretched. And
you mean the time that the lag?
Yes.
So you want to be able to get things more quickly?
Yes, the time, the lag, the communications. Nobody really in today's environment wants to hold inventory. And just the nature of shipping things from China, for instance, implies there's a lot of inventory. This inventory
because you can't afford to not have the product and wait 2 months to get
That's
here.
correct. So you have shiploads of inventory floating around all the time.
So those extra costs, once people discover them, sometimes they say, you know what, it looked cheap, but in real life it's not working out that cheap.
That's correct.
Manufacturing in India or China or what have you.
True. When you add the total dollars, not just the purchase price of a given item, but the total dollars, the logistics, the shipping costs, the holding costs, all of that. When you put dollars to that, you'll find that we are more competitive than a lot of people would imagine. And so we are seeing a part of a movement called reshoring. There are products coming back to the United States, and I think Massachusetts manufacturers stand a very good opportunity to capitalize on that.
So you're in workforce development, which is an interesting area of the business, because I hear these stats thrown around, and I don't know if they're true or not, but I heard somebody say just last week that there are a lot of jobs in this country in manufacturing that go unfilled because there aren't kids coming out of the schools with the knowledge base that's needed to fill the jobs. So they just sit there advertising positions, but nobody comes in qualified. Is that a real narrative in your experience? This is your end of the business.
That is a very fair statement. We have a skills shortage. Some people might refer to it as a skills mismatch, but the fact of the matter is the manufacturing workforce is aging out, like so many other sectors. Our population is aging, and as people leave due to retirements, to backfill people with the skills that are required. Again, we're talking advanced manufacturing, high technology manufacturing.
Well, what is that? Does that mean you need MIT grads?
No, we do not, but we do need, let me put it in some perspective if I can. Today's entry-level manufacturing job 15 years ago or so might have been referred to as a technician. That's not a college-level individual.
It's where you go to a one-year training program to use learn to use the
That's a good way to put it, yes.
And, and how's that shifted?
And that shifted that a lot of people have not had this manufacturing exposure. No,
but has that gotten more complex? Is it no longer the
has.
one-year training program? It's
getting more complex. A one-year training program would be ideal to at least get people into that entry-level slot, and then combine that with on-the-job training. We're seeing more of an evolution to that.
To bring kids in, with a high school degree and let them learn on the job?
Well, the Massmep, for instance, is very much involved in looking at the technical vocational school system. And
terrific schools, aren't they?
The vocational school system is really a gem. However, it does have some needs. It has the needs, for instance, to upgrade its infrastructure to get in line with today's advanced manufacturing. And we've done a lot of
So
work
they have
in that area.
some of the coursework and some of the machinery to support it, or the labs or whatever they have there, is based on what was being done 20 years ago, perhaps?
It was. We're seeing a great shift today. There's been investment made on the local, the state level, and we're working very comprehensively with the schools to look at curriculum. The Massmep has done a lot to promote the applied manufacturing technology pathway certification.
I want to make sure everyone understands this problem, because you said there were jobs going unfilled. We've had high unemployment during a recession that's essentially lasted, a jobs recession anyway, that's lasted since
Going on 8 years.
2008. So yeah, we're going on 8 years now. It's a long time. And one of my personal pet peeves is we have these special interest groups that block innovation, like teachers' unions or school management or the education system for educators. So they have a certain mindset about how education is supposed to be done. And what we really need is an innovative, responsive, market-driven education system, so that it wouldn't take 8 years or 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, because we're talking about trends that have been going on for decades. And still, the schools haven't adjusted to deliver the workforce that's needed, to deliver kids with the background who can walk in and be productive. If you were the czar of infrastructure here in Massachusetts, and none of those special interest groups existed, and none of those impediments existed, if you didn't want them to, what would you change? What would you wish for, waving your magic wand that I want to give you?
Well, I think what I would wish for is what I see happening today. We're
You're
building
being
a demand.
So diplomatic.
We are building a demand-driven system today.
But we're running behind. What's blocking us? That pisses me off that we're running behind. We should.
Enough.
The idea that kids can't walk in and be employable at manufacturers here in the state, the idea that manufacturers have to be fighting to try to get the right to bring somebody in from overseas to fill a job is bizarre.
Well, we're bringing today the manufacturers to the table, and they are driving some change within the system. And again, getting behind a credentialing system, getting behind really instructing the school system as to what's relevant in terms of skills, and making sure those curriculum get implemented, and making sure that we have things like standard testing to make sure that not only know that a person might have gone through 3 years or 4 years of a technical high school, but what did they learn while they were there.
So you're talking about technical schools, not regular schools.
Correct.
You need kids from technical schools.
We need kids from technical schools.
You want them to have the hands-on.
Yes. Yes, we do need them to have hands-on.
And are you talking about testing different from MCAS? Because we've had MCAS for 20 plus years.
Yes, we're testing competencies that are laid out in the Applied Manufacturing Technology Pathway Certification. Very specific,
This is great.
Very specific
now we're getting to the meat
lineup,
of it.
a very specific lineup of skills. And one of the things that isn't mentioned to bring perspective, hasn't been mentioned rather to bring perspective, is the manufacturers in the state of Massachusetts are primarily small businesses. 70% of the 7,400 or so companies that are listed as manufacturers are
How many companies?
7,400. Manufacturers in the state of Massachusetts.
State of Massachusetts,
correct.
And they're small business.
The small businesses, 70% of them are under 20 employees.
And what might they be making? I'm imagining millions of dollars of equipment needed to do any kind of manufacturing. How can that be a small business?
If you look at it by head count, under 20 employees, they may be multi-million-dollar businesses, but they're still small businesses. What does that mean? They don't have an infrastructure internally to do a lot of the training that at one time the large OEMs may have been doing.
But if they're making a ton of money with their 20 people, which is more and more where we're heading, if you're going to have a factory that's got robots doing all the work, and you need a few smart people to make that all work, that could be a $100 million company.
It could be.
And you'd be calling it a small business because it only employs 10 or 20 people.
The classic definition is how many people work in an enterprise. And for instance, on the other side of the scale, Massachusetts only has about 50 companies with over 500 employees. So it's a real.
So the world has
on both
changed
ends,
dramatically.
It has changed dramatically, is right, especially here.
But am I correct about the cost of operating one of these businesses, that you need a ton of capital investment?
Capital is a big factor, no question about it. So you have to be productive. And that's why we don't have a system today where you can allow to have 10 people learning how to do things when there are 20 people actually producing. You have to plug and play. When somebody enters an enterprise like that, they have to be productive from day one.
So are you saying margins are slim on this work? I would think that they'd be very profitable companies.
They can be profitable, but margins are still slim. To your earlier point, capital costs are high. The cost of doing business in Massachusetts is high, just in general terms, with electricity, things like that. So there are other things besides wages. There are other things besides capital equipment. It's the whole system of cost structure, and that employer has to stay ahead, continue to make constant investments. And workforce that we're talking about right now is just one part of that. So it's an interesting challenge for any manufacturer to overcome, and the dynamics just continue to change. The pace of change is far more rapid today in terms of product development, things of those. So we don't have an environment where you can do things at your pace. The pace is driven by other factors outside of your business.
How many businesses did you say employ over 500 people in Massachusetts?
A little over 50
That's
businesses.
just a stunning
over 500
number.
Right.
And a small business employs how many people?
Under 20 is 70% of the manufacturers in the state, and we have in the middle the 100 to 200. We've got another 200 to 300 companies in that range. So it is an environment of small businesses that we have.
But it's a very interesting little tip. So I have this theory that every statistic that is part of our public debate about issues is a misrepresentation of what's actually going on, or a deliberate lie. And politicians are always saying small business is 90% of our economy or whatever. But when you realize it could be a very big business, it's just being rated by the number of employees, that gives you a different sense of it. So how about politics? Does the politics of Massachusetts, the reputation is that the government and the tax structure and regulation stands in the way of these businesses succeeding here, and when they get going and they have their druthers, they move to a state that's less inhibitive of productivity. Is that an accurate perception?
Yes, I think in general terms, absolutely. I think regulations certainly have been a real burden on a lot of the small businesses. And when I look at who is our real competitor, we can talk about China all day long, but I think Texas and Alabama and Mississippi.
It's between the states.
Correct. That's really where your competition
because
is.
Those states, is that reputation accurate, that they are much friendlier and don't
In general terms, they're lower cost. In any way you break things down, they're lower
So can you run
cost.
through those costs for us? Is electricity one of them that's bigger
Yes,
here?
the cost of energy is certainly a big factor. The cost of regulations, not every state has the regulations that we might have here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Are there any glaring examples that an average person could latch onto that you could share that would be expressive of how regulation is different here? Because we hear those kinds of phrases, but people don't necessarily know what that means.
Well, to be specific in what regulations are driving the highest cost, I could say recently we just had an example of a hoisting regulation that was put into.
Ooh, this is good. This is really idiosyncratic.
It really could be.
Hoisting, like in a warehouse, how you raise up
how you raise things, how you lift things.
Stuff?
Correct.
Okay.
So there are federal regulations that govern the manufacturer, and on top of that, the state put on some regulations that
stricter
required
hoisting regulations.
Stricter
here
hoisting
in the state
regulations.
Of
Correct.
I
So that required all manufacturers to go into a whole new conformance mode that was very expensive. They had to re-educate, retrain their employees. Anybody who touched anything that had to be moved. Fortunately, that was addressed.
What were the realities of that regulation, then?
It was very burdensome, and
what did you have to do? Like, you weren't allowed to lift it by hand? You had to use equipment?
No, you had to get new certifications.
Everyone had to be retrained to lift.
Right. Those
to
people
do the lifting
involved,
they were doing every day.
That's correct. Those people involved in those processes had to get recertified, and it was a real constraint on productivity within the small company environment.
Did you see some good in it, despite the burden, or did you just see it as being crazy legislators passing, or a crazy state agency making up things, like they were at a cocktail party and they heard this idea?
Like most regulations, I think they were all done with good intentions, but when I speak to our clients, our employers, if you will, they were not too pleased with that new burden that was imposed on their businesses.
Nobody is.
Right.
And that drives people to move. What's the closest state? Is New Hampshire a much better place? Do you hear that from manufacturers? Where do we lose people to when companies leave?
Again, New Hampshire is a competitive state in the manufacturing sphere, because not only do companies look at the cost direct to the business, but if you have no income tax and things like that, the employee element of it is something a business owner would consider.
I've heard that people move their businesses to New Hampshire because it provides cheaper housing and lower cost of living, but also you can get into Boston easily if you have to, and you can also be up in the Lakes region enjoying summer fun or going to the mountains and skiing.
There are some logistics considerations as well, to your point. But I think the large industrial states like Texas, I think you hear about Texas all the time.
But who wants to move to Texas? Especially if you're a small business owner in Massachusetts. You would think that's torture. Don't answer that question. We've got a break for a minute, and then we'll continue. And then, whatever you want to talk about, we'll talk about, because I've been pushing you around, making you answer my questions. Stay with us. More of the Mass Factor coming up in just a minute. Continuing with Ted Bauer now, it's a fascinating conversation because we hear about the manufacturing problems, and it's really a big political issue, but as with most political issues, people don't really know that much of the nitty-gritty, so thank you for the information you're providing. I think it's really interesting. Let's talk more about what you do then, the workforce development stuff, and what the opportunities are, what the impediments are. What is it people are working on and doing differently to try to get more? Because again, the idea that there are people who could be filling jobs, but they don't have the knowledge, that's a big deal.
It is a big deal. And right now, the real opportunity is to have the employers in this space working together collaboratively, to put together platforms to allow reskilling of people who otherwise are good employees but lack the specific technical skills that these employers need on a day-to-day basis.
So you're talking about long-term employees who are in a job, and maybe the skill set they have has become obsolete.
That is one part of it. Technology is changing on the shop floor, and so when they bring in new technology, what you might have known is no longer relevant. So you have to have a way to train to adopt to that new technology.
And do vendors not normally have training programs for bringing employees up to speed on their equipment?
Oh, there certainly is some of that, but again, as a small business, again, going back to that 20-person, it's expensive to some extent, but you cannot afford to train everybody and not make product on a day-to-day basis. Right. So working collaboratively with other like companies, you can then take people, leverage the fact that you can put a class of, say, 10 people together, maybe between 5 or 6 employers, and begin to reskill or update the skills of your current workforce.
I like that word, reskill. I haven't heard that one before.
And that's a reality today. Again, because technology is changing very rapidly, to your point, reskilling your workforce is going to be an ongoing challenge. And you have to look at that in a strategic fashion. It can't just be, we'll get to it when we have time. You have to think ahead today, because you know the skills needs are going to change. And if you're a business with a good, solid strategic look on employee development, employee skills development, you're certainly going to be ahead of the curve. And that's all part of being competitive, not only to your companies that are around you, but globally. You have to be competitive globally, always be on that cutting edge, and you have to be thinking strategically, how am I going to get my workforce up to the levels that's going to keep up with technology, keep me competitive, keep me profitable. And those are real challenges, and they accelerate as we go on almost every year as we look forward.
And what do you folks at Massmep, are you actually providing any of these services, or are you more organizational? You're helping, talking to employers, finding out what they need, and then providing a liaison maybe over to the management of the technical schools to try to build a better connectivity there?
Well, we do all of the above, actually. We do training on our own. We have the capability to train certain skills. We have the ability to network with other skills training providers, so we become a facilitator, a network source to do things that perhaps within our center we don't have the capability to do. Being part of the national MEP system, we have access to the other resources in the 50 states in the country, so that if there's something unique,
you can reach across state lines.
we can be a broker to bring certain skills training or certain expertise, technical expertise to bear for our local manufacturers here in Massachusetts.
And where's the money come for this? I know you told me off the air that you get about a third of your funding through government grants.
Roughly under the MEP, the NIST MEP system, just in rough terms, about 30% of our budget might come through grants given through that system. Another third is fee for service. In other words, we contract with employers, with manufacturers to deliver certain project work.
With your product.
That's correct. And we do get some state funding. It's not always consistent year to year, but we do have access to some state funding. And we do apply for grants, Department of Labor grants, all types of grants that we do apply for.
But you're not like an association. The employers who get benefited from you aren't members of, they're not paying an annual fee or something like that?
They're not paying an annual fee, but getting services through the MEP, because we do have some subsidization through other sources. They are in effect taking advantage of some of those subsidies to get a lower cost opportunity to gain some of those services that we offer.
We just have a minute left. What's the prognosis for Massachusetts? How are we trending?
I think manufacturing is trending in a positive direction. I think our companies certainly are positioned very well. Again, I think we opened up our conversation with some of the advantages of being in Massachusetts, the school systems, and so forth. We do have a better opportunity, I think, to continue to focus on those competitive challenges that we have. And I think our manufacturing base, the employer base that is here, is really beginning to understand the significance of reinvesting not just in that physical infrastructure, but reinvesting in that the skills development of that employee base.
Do you want to point viewers to a website? Can they learn more about what you folks do?
I'd be happy to. The website is very simple, I hope. It's massmep.org, massmep.org.
That's pretty easy.
I hope so.
And thank you very much for being here. Good luck with getting the word out. I think it's fascinating what you're doing. And it's good to hear the nitty-gritty about business in Massachusetts. So thanks for being here.
Thank you, Todd, for having me. I appreciate that very much.
All right. And that's it for today. We'll see you next time on the Mass Factor.